I learned a long time ago that the loudest person at the scene is almost never the one holding the truth. The first sound I heard that morning was not the gentle water brushing against the old cedar dock or the familiar call of loons drifting across the lake. It was the sharp crunch of tires rolling over the gravel driveway behind my cabin. I had just unlocked the front door with an old brass key that had belonged to my grandfather when flashing emergency lights reflected across the cabin windows. The smell of fresh pine mixed with the rich aroma of hot coffee rising from the mug resting on the porch railing, creating the kind of peaceful morning I had always loved. That peace lasted exactly 3 seconds. "There he is," a woman shouted before a vehicle door even finished closing. "That is the man trespassing on this property." I slowly turned toward the driveway and saw 2 sheriff's deputies stepping out of their sport utility vehicle while a second vehicle stopped behind them. Standing confidently between the patrol vehicles was a well-dressed woman wearing an immaculate white sweater, holding a bright yellow folder beneath one arm, as though she had rehearsed this moment for days. She pointed directly at me with absolute certainty, never questioning whether she might be wrong. Behind her, a tow truck eased onto the gravel road before stopping near the entrance, and several members of the Homeowners Association board climbed out of another vehicle carrying clipboards and cameras. The entire scene felt strangely organized, almost like everyone except me already knew how the morning was supposed to end. One by one, nearby cabin doors opened. Neighbors stepped onto their porches holding coffee mugs, pretending they were simply enjoying the sunrise while quietly watching everything unfold. The older deputy approached with calm professionalism and introduced himself before asking whether I was willing to answer a few questions. I nodded politely and handed him my driver's license without hesitation. Before he could say another word, the woman began speaking again. She introduced herself as Laura Mitchell, president of the Homeowners Association, and confidently explained that I had illegally entered an abandoned cabin after ignoring multiple warnings from the association. She insisted the rightful owner could not be located, claimed the property had accumulated numerous violations, and requested that the deputies remove me immediately. Every sentence came quickly, confidently, and without the slightest doubt. I never interrupted her. Instead, I glanced toward the old cedar bookshelf visible through the open front door. Beneath it rested a blue document box that had remained in exactly the same place for years. My grandfather always believed that important papers deserved a permanent home because memories fade, but properly recorded facts never do. I slipped the brass key back into my pocket and listened quietly while Laura continued building her case against me. She mistook my silence for uncertainty. She smiled as though victory had already arrived. What she did not know was that every confident accusation she made was leading her one step closer to discovering that the quiet man standing on the porch was connected to her own home in a way she had never imagined. My name is Ethan Carter, and if you had driven past that cabin on any ordinary weekend, you would have assumed I was just another homeowner spending his Saturday repairing weathered boards and enjoying the quiet. That assumption had protected my privacy for years. I never believed ownership needed an audience. My grandfather used to tell me that if people respected your work, they would eventually respect your name without you ever having to introduce yourself. Every visit to the cabin followed the same simple routine. I inspected the cedar dock after winter storms, cleaned the gutters before heavy rain, checked the windows for broken seals, and made certain the old stone fireplace stayed dry through every season. Those routines were never chores to me. They were family traditions passed down through 3 generations. I learned to fish from that dock before I learned to drive a truck. I learned how to replace cedar shingles before I ever signed my first business contract. The cabin represented something far more valuable than real estate. It represented responsibility. What almost nobody around Lakewood Shores realized was that the cabin was only one property among several that I quietly owned through a small property management company. Years earlier, I began purchasing neglected lakeside homes whose owners no longer wanted the responsibility of maintaining them. Instead of flipping them for quick profits, I restored every property with the same care my grandfather had taught me, then rented them to families who genuinely appreciated the peaceful life beside the water. The company handled every lease, every maintenance request, every inspection, and every monthly payment. My name rarely appeared during ordinary conversations because I preferred letting my office manage daily operations while I focused on preserving the properties themselves. Standing on the porch while Laura continued explaining why I supposedly did not belong there, I noticed details that quietly contradicted nearly every claim she made. The flower boxes beneath the windows held freshly planted seasonal blooms. The dock had recently received new cedar planks after a spring inspection. The porch railing still carried the rich scent of protective wood stain from work I completed only 2 weeks earlier. Even the gravel driveway had been freshly graded after heavy rain. Nothing about the property suggested abandonment. The older deputy slowly studied the cabin, the shoreline, and the surrounding landscape before glancing back toward Laura. He never interrupted her, but I could see the questions forming behind his calm expression. Well-maintained homes tell their own stories long before anyone opens a file. A gentle breeze carried the smell of pine needles across the lake, while sunlight shimmered over the calm water behind the deputies. I slipped one hand into my jacket pocket and felt the familiar outline of the old brass key resting against my fingers. Through the open front door, I could see the handcrafted cedar bookshelf my grandfather had built decades earlier. Beneath it waited the blue document box that contained every deed, survey, lease agreement, tax record, and ownership document connected to this property. I had no intention of mentioning it yet. Sometimes the strongest evidence becomes even more convincing after everyone else has completely finished making their assumptions. Laura Mitchell carried herself with the confidence of someone who had not been told she was wrong in a very long time. The bright yellow folder tucked beneath her arm looked thick enough to contain an entire season of complaints, complete with highlighted pages, printed photographs, certified notices, and neatly labeled tabs. She spoke with polished certainty, explaining every alleged violation as though she had memorized each sentence before leaving her house that morning. Around Lakewood shores, her reputation had spread long before I ever met her in person. Contractors quietly mentioned that she measured fences with a tape measure. Landscapers joked that she could identify an unapproved shrub from across the street. Delivery drivers knew exactly which mailbox belonged to the president of the Homeowners Association because it always contained another certified envelope waiting to be mailed. Most residents eventually stopped challenging her decisions because arguing required time, paperwork, and patience. Paying a small fine often felt easier than proving a point. Over the years, that pattern slowly convinced Laura that every disagreement naturally ended with people accepting her version of events. Standing on the porch, I watched her point toward the cabin while describing months of supposed neglect. She insisted the owner had ignored repeated notices, failed to respond to Homeowners Association correspondence, and abandoned responsibility for maintaining the property. Every statement sounded organized and convincing until someone actually looked at the cabin itself. Fresh cedar boards lined the dock where I had completed repairs earlier that month. The porch railing still carried the clean scent of protective stain. Window boxes overflowed with healthy flowers that had been watered only the previous evening. Even the American flag hanging beside the front door looked clean and well cared for as it moved gently in the morning breeze. The older deputy quietly studied those details without interrupting Laura's presentation. His partner slowly glanced from the freshly maintained shoreline back toward the cabin before making a few notes inside a small notebook. Neither deputy challenged her explanation, but both men clearly observed that the physical evidence surrounding us told a different story. Nearby neighbors continued gathering along their porches and docks, speaking only in whispers while pretending to organize fishing equipment or waterflower baskets. Nobody wanted to interrupt an official investigation, yet everyone seemed curious about how such a carefully maintained property could possibly be considered abandoned. Laura never noticed the growing uncertainty around her because she remained focused on the papers inside her yellow folder. She believed authority came from organized documents carrying the Homeowners Association logo. She had no reason to imagine another collection of records existed only a few steps away inside the cabin. I rested my hand inside my jacket pocket, touching the familiar brass key while looking briefly through the open doorway toward my grandfather's handcrafted cedar bookshelf. Beneath it remained the blue document box exactly where I had placed it after my last inspection. Every deed, survey, lease agreement, tax receipt, and county record waited inside with quiet patience. My grandfather often reminded me that assumptions can sound convincing for a while, but properly recorded facts never become nervous. They simply wait until someone is finally ready to read them. Laura was convinced the morning was unfolding exactly the way she had planned. She adjusted the yellow folder beneath her arm, looked toward the deputies with complete confidence, and gestured toward my pickup truck parked beside the cabin. "That vehicle should not even be here," she said firmly. "I have already contacted a towing company because unauthorized occupants cannot leave personal vehicles on association property." As if responding to a rehearsed cue, the low rumble of a diesel engine echoed through the tall pine trees. The tow truck slowly rolled farther into the gravel driveway before stopping several yards behind the patrol vehicles. The driver remained inside, waiting patiently for instructions from law enforcement before making a single move. Laura smiled with quiet satisfaction, believing every piece of her plan was falling perfectly into place. She opened her yellow folder and handed several organized documents to the older deputy. Every page contained highlighted notes, printed photographs, inspection reports, violation notices, and copies of homeowners association correspondence. She explained each section carefully, pointing to dates, signatures, and community regulations while insisting the property owner had ignored repeated attempts to resolve the situation. The deputies accepted the paperwork without interruption. Around us, more neighbors quietly wandered onto their porches carrying coffee mugs or pretending to organize fishing gear while carefully listening to every word. The calm lake reflected the bright morning sun, and the scent of freshly cut grass drifted across the shoreline as a light breeze moved through the cedar trees. When Laura finally finished presenting her folder, the older deputy looked across the property one more time before asking a simple question. "Ma'am, do any of these documents establish legal ownership of the property?" Laura hesitated briefly before answering. "Ownership is not the issue. Community compliance is the issue." The deputy acknowledged her response with a slight nod, but continued studying the surroundings. His eyes moved from the freshly stained porch railing to the recently repaired dock, then toward the healthy flower boxes beneath the windows. Nothing suggested months of neglect. Every detail reflected regular care and ongoing maintenance. One of the homeowners association board members quietly stepped forward carrying another clipboard while a second member photographed the porch, the driveway, my truck, and the dock from several different angles. Camera shutters clicked repeatedly through the peaceful morning air. Laura appeared pleased with every photograph, convinced they strengthened her position. I remained exactly where I was, saying almost nothing. My grandfather used to remind me that people often reveal the limits of their confidence when they are allowed to keep talking without interruption. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and felt the familiar brass key resting against my fingers. Just beyond the open front door stood the handcrafted cedar bookshelf he built decades ago. Beneath its lowest shelf waited the blue document box containing county deeds, recorded surveys, tax records, ownership documents, and signed lease agreements. Laura believed the thick yellow folder represented the strongest evidence anyone could bring to the porch that morning. She had absolutely no reason to suspect that only a few feet away rested a quiet blue box containing enough verified records to change the entire direction of the day with nothing more than carefully preserved facts. The older deputy closed Laura's yellow folder and looked toward me with the same calm professionalism he had maintained since arriving. "Sir," he said, "would you like to respond before we make any decisions?" I looked at the coffee mug resting on the porch railing, picked it up, and took one slow sip while the morning breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh lake water across the property. The warmth of the cup felt strangely reassuring. I set it back down exactly where it had been before answering. "Yes," I replied quietly, "but I would rather respond with documents than opinions." Laura gave a small smile, convinced I was simply trying to delay the inevitable. "Anyone can claim ownership," she said confidently. "We have already spent months trying to locate the real owner." Neither deputy reacted to her comment. The older deputy simply looked back at me. "Do you have documentation establishing your legal authority to be here?" I nodded once. "The original records are inside the cabin." Laura folded her arms. "If he printed something from the internet this morning, that does not make it legitimate." Again, neither deputy responded. The older deputy asked only one question. "Would you be willing to retrieve the records?" "Absolutely." I answered without hesitation. Slowly, I reached into my jacket pocket and wrapped my fingers around the old brass key. My grandfather always said a key was more than a piece of metal. It represented trust that had been earned over time. I stepped toward the front door while both deputies remained on the porch observing everything carefully. Laura stayed exactly where she was, completely relaxed, convinced that whatever I brought back could never overcome the thick folder she had spent weeks preparing. The brass key slipped smoothly into the old lock with a familiar metallic click that immediately carried me back to childhood summers spent helping my grandfather open this very cabin before sunrise. I pushed the cedar door inward, and warm morning light spread across the polished wooden floor. Directly ahead stood the handcrafted cedar bookshelf that my grandfather built with his own hands decades earlier. Beneath the lowest shelf rested the blue document box exactly where I had placed it after my last inspection. I knelt, released the metal latches, and briefly confirmed that every folder remained perfectly organized. County deeds, survey maps, property tax records, insurance certificates, lease agreements, maintenance histories. Every document sat neatly labeled and protected inside waterproof sleeves. I closed the lid, lifted the box with both hands, and carried it back toward the porch. As I stepped outside, conversations among the nearby neighbors quietly faded until only the sound of gentle waves touching the dock remained. Every person watching seemed to understand that something important was about to happen. Laura continued wearing the same confident expression, certain the blue box contained nothing capable of changing her carefully prepared narrative. She did not realize that the strongest evidence is rarely the loudest. Sometimes it arrives in complete silence, carried inside an ordinary storage box that has patiently protected the truth for years while waiting for the exact moment someone finally asks to see it. The blue document box rested on the weathered porch table with a quiet thud that seemed to silence every conversation around the lake. I released the metal latches and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, every folder remained exactly where my grandfather had taught me to keep it, carefully labeled, protected, and organized by property, year, and document type. The older deputy asked if he could examine the records, and I nodded before sliding the first folder toward him. County property deeds, recorded survey maps, property tax receipts, insurance certificates. Every page carried official recording numbers, government seals, signatures, and filing dates stretching back decades. The younger deputy opened the computer inside the patrol sport utility vehicle and began comparing parcel identification numbers with the county database, while his partner carefully reviewed the original documents. Laura leaned forward slightly, trying to follow every page without actually touching the files. Her confident smile remained in place, but I noticed it becoming smaller each time another document confirmed exactly what the previous one had already established. The morning breeze gently lifted the corner of a survey map before the deputy placed his hand across it to keep everything neatly arranged. After several quiet minutes, he looked up from the paperwork and asked, "Mr. Carter, are you the owner of Carter Lakeside Property Management?" "Yes," I answered. "I established the company several years ago." He acknowledged my answer with a slight nod before reaching into the blue document box again. "May I review the active lease files?" "Please do," I replied. He removed another folder organized alphabetically and began reading through several lease agreements. His eyes paused on one particular file. Without saying anything, he handed it to the younger deputy, who carefully reviewed the first page, compared the property address to the county records, and then turned directly toward Laura. "Ma'am," he asked politely, "would you please confirm your current residential address?" Laura answered immediately, giving the address of the lakefront home she had occupied for nearly 2 years. The younger deputy quietly compared her answer to the lease agreement before rotating the document toward her. I watched her expression slowly change as her eyes moved from the property address to the tenant information and finally to the signature page. There, beneath her own signature, appeared the name of the property owner authorized to lease the residence. Mine. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Gentle waves continued touching the dock, while birds called from somewhere beyond the pine trees. One homeowners association board member slowly lowered his clipboard. Another quietly slipped his camera back into its case. Even the tow truck driver leaned forward inside his cab, realizing the situation had changed without anyone raising a voice. Laura looked back at the lease agreement as though hoping she had misunderstood what she was reading. The older deputy calmly closed the folder and looked at her with quiet professionalism. The official county records, the recorded deed, the parcel information, and the signed lease agreement all pointed to the same conclusion. The man she had confidently accused of occupying property without permission was not only the lawful owner of the cabin standing behind him, but also the landlord whose signature appeared on the lease agreement she had personally signed months before. Every assumption that had carried her through the morning quietly disappeared beneath the weight of carefully preserved facts. For several long moments, nobody on the porch seemed interested in speaking. The only sounds came from gentle waves brushing against the cedar dock and leaves moving softly through the pine trees above us. The older deputy carefully closed the lease folder before looking directly at Laura. His voice remained calm, respectful, and completely free of judgment. "Ma'am, the county records, the recorded deed, and the signed lease agreement all identify Mr. Carter as the lawful owner of this cabin and the landlord connected to your lease." Those words settled over the gathering with remarkable quiet. One of the Homeowners Association board members slowly lowered his clipboard until it rested against his side. Another slipped his camera back into its carrying case without taking another photograph. The tow truck driver stepped out of his truck for a brief moment, looked toward the deputies, then quietly climbed back inside after realizing there would be no vehicle to remove. Laura stared at the lease agreement again as though expecting the words to rearrange themselves into a different conclusion. "I have never met him," she finally said in a much quieter voice than before. I nodded politely. "That is true," I answered. "My management office handles daily communication with tenants. Most residents never meet me unless there is a unique situation involving the property itself." The younger deputy continued reviewing several additional files inside the blue document box. Maintenance authorizations, inspection reports, property insurance renewals, tax payment confirmations. Every document pointed toward the same ownership records already verified through the county database. The entire chain of documentation fit together without a single inconsistency. Laura slowly lowered the yellow folder she had carried so confidently only minutes earlier. The highlighted notices, printed photographs, and Homeowners Association correspondence suddenly seemed much less important beside official public records that had existed long before the disagreement began. Across the shoreline, neighbors quietly returned to their morning routines. A retired couple resumed drinking coffee on their deck. A father helped his son untangle a fishing line near the dock. Nobody celebrated what had happened. Nobody mocked Laura. The truth did not require applause because it had already accomplished everything it needed to accomplish. The older deputy carefully returned every document to the blue storage box exactly as he had found it. Before closing the lid, he looked at me and offered a respectful smile. "You keep excellent records, Mr. Carter. Situations like this become much easier when documentation is organized." His words immediately reminded me of my grandfather sitting at the old wooden table inside the cabin, carefully labeling folders year after year. He often told me that people forget conversations, memories become uncertain, and opinions change with time, but properly preserved records remain patient until someone finally needs them. Standing there on the porch, I realized his lesson had never been about paperwork alone. It had always been about protecting peace. The blue document box had not defeated anyone that morning. It had simply allowed verified facts to speak after everyone else had finished making assumptions, and sometimes that is the quietest and strongest form of justice a person can ever witness. The deputies carefully returned every document to the blue storage box before fastening the metal latches exactly the way they had found them. The older deputy thanked me once again for my cooperation, then turned toward Laura with the same calm professionalism he had shown from the beginning. He explained that the ownership question had been fully resolved through official county records and properly recorded legal documents. Any future concerns involving Homeowners Association compliance, he added, should be addressed through appropriate civil procedures after ownership had been accurately verified. Laura listened quietly. The confidence that had carried her through the morning had slowly been replaced by thoughtful silence. She closed the yellow folder without another argument and stepped away from the porch, looking across the calm lake for several long seconds before thanking the deputies for their time. Around us, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. Conversations resumed in quiet voices along neighboring docks. The retired couple across the shoreline lifted their coffee mugs in a friendly greeting before returning to breakfast. The father preparing his fishing boat smiled politely and continued loading his equipment. The tow truck driver started his engine, backed carefully onto the gravel road, and disappeared between the tall pine trees without ever attaching a single chain. The flashing emergency lights faded into the distance until only the natural sounds of the lake remained. One member of the homeowners association board lingered behind after everyone else began leaving. He hesitated before asking whether copies of the county ownership records could be obtained so future questions could be handled more accurately. I explained that the county recorder maintained public records specifically for that purpose, and that verifying ownership before making assumptions usually prevented unnecessary conflict. He thanked me sincerely, tucked his clipboard beneath his arm, and quietly walked back toward his vehicle. During the following week, my property manager called with unexpected news. Several residents had begun requesting additional transparency from the homeowners association before accepting violation notices. Board members were discussing new procedures requiring ownership verification through public records before formal enforcement actions could begin. Nothing dramatic happened overnight, but something important had clearly shifted. People had become more interested in facts than appearances. They were asking better questions, reading official documents more carefully, and relying less on assumptions. After everyone had gone, I carried the blue document box back inside the cabin and slid it beneath my grandfather's handcrafted cedar bookshelf where it had rested for years. The old brass key returned to my jacket pocket after I locked the front door, and my coffee mug still waited on the porch railing, only slightly cooler than it had been when the deputies first arrived that morning. I picked it up and looked across the peaceful water reflecting the afternoon sky. The cabin stood exactly as it had before a single patrol vehicle entered the driveway. The dock remained solid. The flower boxes remained full. The quiet lake continued reflecting the pine trees with perfect clarity. Nothing about the property had truly changed. Only the people had. They had witnessed how carefully preserved truth could quietly reshape an entire situation without anger, without humiliation, and without raising a single voice above the gentle sounds of the water.